PagerDuty Postmortem, April 20, 2023 Incident. A DevOps Postmortem. It's 12:20 p.m. PDT on April 20, 2023, and the very system designed to scream when things go wrong has just gone silent. Imagine being an SRE at PagerDuty, the company whose entire business model is built on being the ultimate failsafe for everyone else, and suddenly your own platform starts crumbling. It wasn't just a minor glitch. It was a full-scale collapse of incident creation, notifications, and the web UI. For several hours, the pulse of the platform flatlined. When the tools meant to alert the world that something is broken stop working, you aren't just facing a bug, you're facing an existential crisis. The stakes were absolute because if PagerDuty couldn't notify its users, thousands of other companies were flying blind into their own fires. Something deep in the guts of the infrastructure had just fractured, and for the next few hours, the only thing more terrifying than the outage was the irony of it all. Imagine a world where the only thing standing between an engineer and a catastrophic system failure is a single notification on their phone. That's exactly what PagerDuty provides. They are the backbone of incident response, the who to call button for every tech company on Earth. When their platform goes dark, the entire ecosystem of modern IT support starts to crumble because nobody knows who's supposed to be fixing the fires. On April 20, 2023, that lifeline was severed. The system didn't just flicker. It suffered a massive degradation, starting at 12:20 p.m. PDT, crippling incident creation and the web UI for their customers. When your primary tool for managing emergencies stops working during an emergency, you aren't just dealing with a bug, you're facing a total blackout of the safety net. For those few hours, the very people responsible for keeping the internet running were left flying blind without their primary navigation system. It was a typical day for the PagerDuty team until the clock hit 12:20 p.m. PDT on April 2023. For most of the platform's users, everything was functioning as intended, notifications were firing, and the web UI was responsive. But beneath the surface, a subtle shift was brewing in an internal service responsible for feature flagging and dynamic configuration. Someone pushed a configuration change, something that seemed routine but carried a hidden sting. It wasn't a massive spike in traffic or a hardware failure. It was a logic flaw that would buckle under pressure. At first, it might have looked like minor degradation, just a slight hiccup in the gears. But as the system began to struggle with the new configuration, the foundation started to crack. The quiet before the storm was about to end, and a cascading failure was preparing to take down core functionalities across the entire platform. It started at exactly 12:20 p.m. PDT on April 20, 2023. For a company whose entire business model is built on being the first responder for tech failures, it was a haunting irony to have their own house go up in flames. The first signs were subtle degraded performance across the platform, but within 10 minutes, the cracks widened into a chasm. Notifications stopped firing, the web UI became unresponsive, and the core functionality of the system began to buckle under its own weight. By 12 p.m. PDT, the incident response team was officially engaged. They weren't looking at a simple glitch. They were staring at a cascading failure triggered by an internal service responsible for feature flagging and dynamic configuration. The dashboard was screaming, showing that the very system designed to alert engineers about disasters was currently failing to do so. It was the ultimate irony. The alarm for the alarm had gone silent. It started as a localized tremor at 12:20 p.m. PDT, but it didn't stay that way for long. A single configuration change in an internal service, the one responsible for feature flagging and dynamic configuration, acted like a poisoned seed. Instead of just breaking one feature, the bug caused that specific service to buckle under load. This triggered a domino effect, a classic cascading failure where the weight of the system's demands crushed downstream dependencies. By the time the response team was engaged at 12:30 p.m. PDT, the rot had spread across the platform's core functions. Incident creation, notifications, and even the web UI were buckling under the strain. It wasn't just a glitch. It was a systemic collapse where one faulty configuration turned a manageable issue into a full-blown outage that paralyzed PagerDuty's primary mission for hours. So, what actually broke the gears? It wasn't a rogue line of code in the public API or a massive DDoS attack. The rot started deep inside an internal service responsible for feature flagging and dynamic configuration. Someone pushed a configuration change that looked harmless on paper, but it contained a critical bug. When the system hit peak loads, this specific flaw caused the service to buckle under pressure. Because so many downstream systems relied on these flags to function, that single failure triggered a massive cascading collapse across the entire platform. By 12:20 p.m. PDT, the core infrastructure was buckling, and by the time they pinpointed the exact config change, at 1:45 p.m. PDT, the ripple effect had already crippled incident creation and notifications. It was a classic House of Cards scenario where one faulty internal toggle took down the whole deck. When the clock hit 12:20 p. PDT on April 20, 2023, the ground didn't just shake. It disintegrated. This wasn't a minor in a corner of the app, it was a total collapse of the core platform. For 3.5 hours, the very tools designed to manage chaos became part of the chaos. Incident creation, notifications, and the entire web UI went dark or degraded, leaving customers screaming into a void, while PagerDuty's own systems failed them. The blast radius hit the heart of the operation, crippling functionality across the board until 3:30 p.m. PDT, when things finally stabilized. It wasn't just some slowdown in a sub-service. It was a cascading failure that paralyzed the primary mission of the company. When your notification system stops sending alerts, you aren't just dealing with a bug, you're facing a total blackout of the emergency lights. The sirens started wailing at 12:20 p.m. PDT when the platform began to buckle under degraded performance. By 12:30 p.m., the incident response team was in the trenches, staring at a dashboard that was essentially screaming at them. It wasn't just a minor glitch. Core functionalities like notifications and the web UI were flatlining. The pressure was palpable as they hunted for the ghost in the machine. By 1:00 p.m. PDT, the engineers pinned down a strong hypothesis. A recent configuration change in an internal service was the culprit. They spent the next 45 minutes in a high-stakes hunt until that specific broken config was confirmed at 1:45 p.m. They pulled the plug on that change at 2:00 p.m., and just like that, the tide began to turn. By 3:30 p.m. PDT, the system finally settled into a full restoration, leaving the team exhausted but victorious. By the time the clock hit 1:45 p.m. PDT, the team finally pinned down the culprit, a botched configuration change in an internal service responsible for feature flagging and dynamic configuration. It was a classic poison pill that caused the system to buckle under load, triggering a massive cascading failure across the entire platform. The fix was surgical but necessary. They rolled back that specific configuration and immediately scaled up the affected services to absorb the backlog of traffic. By 2:30 p.m. PDT, we saw the first signs of life as services began recovering significantly. Full restoration finally hit at 3:30 p.m. PDT after a grueling few hours of firefighting. To keep this nightmare from haunting them again, they're tightening up testing for critical config changes and building better isolation into their core internal infrastructure to stop a single failure from taking down the whole house. Look, if there's one thing this mess taught us, it's that a small configuration tweak in an internal service isn't just a minor change, it's a potential landmine. When that specific bug hit the feature flagging and dynamic configuration service, it didn't just break one button, it triggered a cascading failure across the entire platform. We saw how quickly a single point of failure can turn into a systemic meltdown when isolation isn't baked into the architecture. The real takeaway here is that critical infrastructure needs more than just hope as a safety net. We need rigorous validation for every config change and much tighter observability to catch these ripples before they become tsunamis. By the time 3:30 p.m. PDT rolled around, the dust had settled, but the lesson remained clear. If your core services aren't resilient enough to handle unexpected load, one bad line of code can bring the whole house down. That's how PagerDuty turned a very bad day into a lesson. If this saved you an outage, subscribe for the next postmortem.